Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Ada Skiles, and I'm the Associate Director at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. On behalf of Chapin Hall, I would like to welcome you to our Child and Family Policy Forum. We would like to thank those of you who are here today in person and those joining us in our live video webcast. We appreciate that you're taking the time to be with us today. Today's program is entitled Using Data to Drive Innovation and Improve Services, Workforce Development in Chicago. I know you will find today's conversation both lively and informative. Moderating our panel of experts on the topic is Chapin Hall's Executive Director, Matt Stagner. Again, thank you very much for participating in today's program. I'll now turn the program over to Matt, and he will introduce our panel of experts.
Thank you, Ada, and thanks to all of you for coming. We have about 300 people signed up for the webcast and about 100 people here at the Gleacher Center joining us. So we're very pleased with the interest in this topic and hope that over the next hour and a half we will inform you and raise some questions and have some great dialogue. So as you all know, this has been a difficult time for workforce in the U.S. and in Cook County and Chicago over the last few years. And it's a good time to take stock of how the workforce system can best address the struggling economy as well as the needs of those who want to reattach or improve their prospects within that economy. So today we'll be talking about how reliable data and information can really be used to improve workforce programs and services, and we're very pleased to have multiple perspectives on that. So I'm going to introduce our panel. There are four full bios in your packet. I'm not going to tell you all the wonderful things that these four people have done, but simply introduce them with their current titles, but you can read about them in your packets. We will then have each of them speak, and at the end we hope to leave a decent amount of time for questions from the audience here in Chicago as well as the web audience. For the web audience, there are three ways to get questions to us. You can tweet them at Chapin Forum. You can go to UChicago Live Facebook page and write questions there, or you can send an email to policyforum@chapinhall.org. So as we get into the Q&A, I will go back and forth between questions from the audience here. I was going to say the live audience, but the truth is the people watching on the web are live as well. They're just not with us. And we will have some conversation. So our first speaker, we're really very pleased to have, will be Karen Norrington-Reeves. Karen is the CEO of the newly formed Chicago Cook Workforce Partnership, which she will be talking about. This is a very exciting time for workforce development in the Chicago Cook region, and we're very pleased that Karen was able to join us today. Secondly, we have an old friend of ours, someone who's worked with us over the last few years as we've gotten into workforce issues, Carrie Thomas, who is the Associate Director of the Chicago Jobs Council. We'll then take a research perspective with Beth Wiegensberg, who's a senior researcher at Chapin Hall and who will be describing some recent work we have done looking at identified successful programs and the types of data systems and data needs that they define. And then finally, we'll hear from somebody who's more on the ground actually doing this work day in and day out, Maria Kim, who is the COO of the CARA program. So with that, I will turn it over to Karen to begin our program.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So I want to give you a brief update and overview, if you will, of what's going on with respect to workforce development in the Cook County area. As I'm sure most of you have heard, nearly a year ago, President Preckwinkle of the Cook County Board and newly elected Mayor Rahm Emanuel met together to talk about ways in which they could collaborate and not only streamline costs, because we're in such a crisis from a fiscal perspective, but also figure out how to improve the delivery of a variety of services to their constituencies. And so they put together a panel of folks who investigated about 51 different areas of potential collaboration and came back with recommendations on 19. And one of those 19 areas was in workforce development. And the recommendation was that rather than continue to function with 3 separate local Workforce Investment Act administrative agencies in the region, that they combine those administrative agencies into one and really figure out how to be more innovative with respect to the delivery of services, streamline costs not only from an administrative perspective, but costs with respect to our delegate agencies and the processes that they have to go through, and create a more uniform system for the delivery of services within Cook County. And so what has come from that is our consolidation efforts. And we actually learned last week that we're using the wrong terminology. It is not consolidation. It is a reconfiguration of the LWIAs. So now, mind you, when it started off, I tried to get people to stop saying merger, then I got them to all say consolidation, and now I have to get them to say reconfiguration instead. So some of the goals of our collaborative efforts were to, as I mentioned, reduce costs, reduce the overhead of the administrative costs. So I can tell you, for example, when I started with what was then known as POET, the President's Office of Employment Training, now known as Cook County Works, we had a staff of about 56, and our budget in that year, we received about $15 million from the federal government to administer local WIA services. And about $5 million of our budget was going to our own administrative costs. And I'm sorry, that was just the pure personnel costs. That wasn't all of the extras included. So really it was closer to about $7 million once you include fringe and all the extra administrative costs. Comparatively, in northern Cook County, where there was a budget of about $14 million for that year, there's only a staff of 8. And less than $1 million going to administrative costs. So we really were not maximizing our resources. Since then, we've reduced our staff to 20, and all of those dollars that would have been going for our administrative costs are now going back into services for clients, as they should be. And so as we look to streamline our services, we said, well, if you look at what's happening in LWIA 7, LWIA 8, LWIA 9, everyone has program staff, everyone has fiscal staff, everyone has compliance staff. If we brought all those resources together, we could translate that into greater funds for our client services. We also are looking at data. More data sharing, and quite frankly, improving the access to data and paying attention to the type of data that we are not only requesting from our agencies, but that we are able to translate into improved practice. One of the other areas of focus was really straying away from looking at workforce development as a social service and seeing it really as an economic engine. Some of the guiding principles with respect to the collaborative efforts really focused on the fact that the greater Chicagoland area is a regional labor market. No one's just looking exclusively at Chicago. And so if we're looking at a regional labor market, shouldn't we be looking at a regional labor force? And how do we do that if we're not all on the same page with respect to the administration of the federal dollars that we get? Also, in consolidating the agencies, we really wanted to focus on creating a situation where we had a smaller, more nimble board that would be able to help us leverage the WIA resources and access greater funding, which is why we're moving away from having a unit of local government and moving into a 501c3. Finally, we really wanted to focus on data-driven outcomes and looking at the dollars spent per outcome and really trying to make an impact on the unemployment rate within the entire region. This shows you just sort of the current state of things. So On your far left, you'll see there's 4 boxes. The first one represents the Chicago Workforce Investment Council, which really is a 501c3 that has served as the strategy and policy-making arm of the city's workforce development agency within the Department of Family and Social Services. So DFSS is represented below QUIC, and then to the right of that is Cook County Works, and to the right of that, Northern Cook County. And so moving from the current state of 4 different entities responsible for the larger administration of the public dollars and moving into a 501c3 with a staff of about 50 to 60 and a smaller board. You see in the second box there in each of those columns, it shows you the breakdown of the number of board members. So in Cook County, we actually used to have 74 board members to administer WIA. That then got reduced to 48 when I started and is now down to 28. So those numbers are really unwieldy, and it's very difficult to manage with a board of that size. So what we're recommending is a much smaller board. It will ultimately be somewhere between 15 and 19 board members. I'm going to skip through a couple of these slides and get you to where we are now. So the announcement of the consolidation was made in late October. Since that time, we have put together a team of consultants and other experts. We have representatives from several foundations, including the Fry Foundation and the Joyce Foundation, that have been offering expertise to us. By the end of March, and probably more the early part of April, we will have the new agency legally established. We're essentially taking the 501c3 under which QUIC currently operates and expanding its mission and amending the Articles of Incorporation. Then we'll have a new corporate board in place, and then we will be issuing a uniform RFP for all of the region. Currently, if you are a delegate agency such as the CARA program or Central States SARE, and you wanted to provide service in Chicago and Northern Cook and South and West Suburban Cook, you would have to complete anywhere from 3 to 9 different RFPs. And so we will issue one uniform RFP for all of the regions so that any entity will just have to go through that process one time as opposed to all those number of times. We will have our staffing plan implemented by the end of June. We actually expect to have the hiring plan finalized by tomorrow. All of our job descriptions will be finished tomorrow. And in the next week or so, we'll be able to post our job descriptions as well as the new organizational structure, which has been vetted with DCEO and DOL. And then our new program year begins July 1st. So our next steps are to continue our work around system redesign. We've been holding a couple of strategy sessions. We've held some listening sessions with the delegate agencies and also all of the community colleges throughout the county. We'll be also reaching out to other stakeholders, such as our foundation community and the business community. We will complete our transition plan and issue the RFP for program year 2012, get the new agency completely up and running, and it's, as Matt mentioned, the Chicago Cook Workforce Partnership, and will just be known as the partnership, and implement our staffing plan, and then we will submit the formal request for reorganization, or excuse me, reconfiguration to the State Workforce Investment Board, which will reflect our new board structure, the agency structure, as well as the system redesign. We are heavily focusing on data driving not only our the framing of our system, but also really ensuring that we are focusing on the end result, which is not just training for training's sake, but ensuring that we are facilitating training-aligned placements for our clients. So, with that, I will pass it over to Carrie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Can you hear me? Okay. So,
Sure. Sorry.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel, so thank you to Chapin Hall. It's really a timely issue, I think, especially with the reconfiguration happening. I can work on that. I got to consolidation. I can work on reconfiguration. I think it's especially a great opportunity that the focus is actually on service delivery and really understanding what works and what doesn't work, and the role of data, and really having an opportunity to talk about that. So quickly, I just would like to say a little bit about the Chicago Jobs Council. So clearly, we are not the local WIB. So for folks who are on the webcast who are not from Chicago, I just want that to be clear. We are a 30-year-old nonprofit organization. We are member-based, and we do a range of activities, mostly around policy advocacy and policy development, engaging a lot of stakeholders, including our members. And then we do capacity building work. We do a wide range of professional development with frontline staff of organizations. Our mission is to work with our members to advance employment and career advancement opportunities for people living in poverty. And the majority of our members are community-based organizations and providers of services. We work in the city, but we also work in communities across the state. So we hear and understand a wide variety of perspectives from the field. So today, what I wanted to do was give kind of a high-level perspective about what we have learned and observed about the role of workforce data and information amongst a variety of stakeholders. But really, I'm focusing on community-based providers and advocates. That's really the perspective I'd like to bring. But I do think the issues that I'm going to talk about are familiar to public administrators, researchers, and others. So I'm going to outline some key issues, and I've put that into 4 sort of buckets of information: finding data, requiring data, and applying data. So here, in this area of finding data, the main and I think obvious point is that there is a high level of need for relevant workforce data and information in the field and for advocates. And this experience of trying to find data raises some important questions. So first is the question, does the workforce data we have, whether we or a provider has it in-house, whether they have access to it or whether it even exists, does it answer the questions that we have? So are we asking the right questions? Are the people collecting data asking the right questions? This also implies, are providers and people in the community, are they able to inform data collection efforts that often happen by government and by researchers? A second question, which is really a subset of this, is whether we have workforce data and information that answers policymakers and funders' questions. They often have somewhat nuanced questions. They aren't necessarily driven by exactly the same concerns. And it's really a big issue to providers whether that they can answer those questions, because they want to be responsive. The last question, area of questions that comes up is really how providers and advocates can find the right external sources of information to augment what they understand internally about what they do. So most community-based organizations and providers can quickly and easily talk about what happens in their service delivery and in their programs, but really they want to make sure that they're communicating that to people who need to understand the context in which they're working. So they are often looking for things like poverty information, unemployment rates, trends in their communities, and it's not always that easy for them to find that information so that it's relevant to their to the audience that they want to communicate with. And I'll just give an example of something that we at the Chicago Jobs Council do in this area. We have an online portal called the Workforce Information and Resource Exchange, which is accessible from our website. And it's simply a way that we take information that we get every day from policymakers and conversations and meetings that we're in, and we put that online to be used by our members and other stakeholders. And we talk with them about how they'd like to see information. So one of the examples that we've done is we've created a page around poverty data. So we know that many people can get to the census website, they can do a Google search, they can find poverty data. But what we've done is we've given them some more context for understanding the tools that are out there and to understanding where to go to get it. We're not generating new information about poverty. We're simply giving providers and other stakeholders the tools for getting to the right information that they can use. So the second area around requiring data, as many people know, and as many providers are very familiar with, there's a lot of requiring of data and information that happens. Sometimes it's requiring certain outcomes to be reported. Sometimes it's requiring extensive demographic information. It's milestones of what kind of services you're providing. And the main point here for community-based providers and the service delivery system is that there's a lot of difference. So there's different sources of funding, there's different reporting requirements, there's different formats for reporting requirements. It's just a fact that's out there. It can really complicate things, interfere with things. One of the big issues that we see is that different required measures or measures and outcomes that are required can really affect services in unintended ways. So the most clear example that I think many people who work in workforce development hear about is that a singular focus on job placement can mean that providers eliminate certain kinds of services for people or place people into jobs when really they could have spent a little bit more time on getting one additional credential that would have really made a difference in the long term, or they simply avoid serving certain individuals that they know it will take longer to serve or may really struggle to get and keep that job. So that's an obvious example. I think another example is that if a provider has staff that have to fill out multiple formats and multiple forming with the exact same information, it simply means that there's less time to spend delivering services. It also means you need slightly different capacity in your staff. And that, I don't think that's anybody's intention when they ask for data or information, but that is kind of an unintended consequence on service delivery. And then lastly, which I think is a subset of that, is there really is unequal organizational capacity in the field to do anything with data, to collect it, to report it, to use it, and to apply it. So this last area is really about how community-based providers, community-based advocates apply data in their work on a day-to-day basis. I just want to flag 4 top areas that we've observed. The first one is really around program development and planning. So really using labor market information, community trends, trends in unemployment and poverty in communities to understand how services should change, understand what services are going to be needed in the future and how to be responsive to an organization's mission. Then 2 slightly different ways of applying data that people are probably familiar with is around outcomes and results. And the first is really that a lot of providers use data to understand their own internal outcomes. How are they doing against the benchmarks they set for themselves? But also, they would like to, as much as possible, understand what happens to their graduates, to their program participants, to students following, after they've been in a program. And ideally, if there were a data source that they had access to that could tell them a little bit about where people are in the labor market, or if they've gone to another, gone further in education, that would be terrific. Because the way that a lot of providers find out is simply using their own staff time to do follow-up and outreach. And often it's just a phone call or an email, and potentially to somebody who doesn't have that phone number anymore. Related to that is really this issue around communicating those outcomes and results, which is different because it's really about external audiences and having the right tools and ability to take the information you have and make it meaningful to a variety of audiences. And providers are actually doing that on a regular basis, and I think we'll see some of that today. And it's very important for people to be able to do that and to have the right information. And then finally, and not the least important, and maybe you can see this graphic that I used, which has about a bunch of symbols going into a funnel, and out at the other end comes money. So it's not that clear, but it kind of makes the point, which is that a lot of the reason that we collect and use data is to really raise funds to support the services that are needed. And so it really is important for community providers and advocates to have access to and be able to put together the right information in such a way that the people, whether they're private funders or public funders, really understand what they're doing, and can see that it's aligned with their mission and their priorities of the funders, or the whether they're public or private, and then that they actually feel a sense of confidence that the provider or the program can deliver on what they'd like to see. So that really concludes my remarks today. I just wanted to give kind of a general perspective. And this is my contact information. That's our website. And I'd encourage people to go to our website and to look at the WIRE, the Workforce Information Resource Exchange, just to see some of the ways that we have developed to provide the community-based provider community with resources to use data. Thank you.
Great. Beth?
Good morning. I don't know if you can hear me yet. I just wanted to thank everyone again for your attendance, your online participation. I think this is a great opportunity, not only for us on the panel to kind of share our perspectives and our work, but also as Representative Chapin Hall to be able to communicate some of the recent research we've been doing the last several years in workforce development. For those of you who know Chapin Hall, this is a relatively new area for the organization, but we have been definitely growing in this area the last several years, starting with a lot of our work that we've titled Quick Stats, which is a lot of research and data work to support the Chicago Workforce Investment Council, as well as many other studies that have emerged from that work. And so the presentation that I'll be talking about today is one of those particular studies looking at data and successful factors among many of the promising community-based organizations and workforce in Chicago. One of the other things I just wanted to mention before I started on the presentation is in the handout folders, and hopefully at some point online, you'll also see a nice summary of all of the workforce development work that Chapin Hall has done. So you can see a little bit more about this particular study as well as some of our other work folks may be interested in as well. And before I begin on this particular study, I just wanted to mention that our initial aim was to have our full Chapin Hall report on this study due by early March. We're kind of working a little bit more on that given the plethora of data we had with this particular study. So it will be released in the coming weeks, definitely before the end of March. And so if we have all your contact information, we'll be sure to disseminate that and share that with you once that is available. So the title of my presentation is really looking inside the black box, trying to identify and measure really what makes workforce development programs so successful. We've heard a lot in our work in workforce development in Chicago in recent years, a lot of what Carrie kind of explained in terms of the use of data, the need for better data, some of the challenges around data, and we really wanted to understand, well, those programs that are doing well, kind of why are they doing well, and how do they use data and information to really support their work. And so this was really our attempt at trying to understand that and dissect that a bit more. Before I go on, I just wanted to acknowledge that this work was really generously supported by the Ford Foundation, and also really was the product of a large team of researchers at Chapin Hall that really supported this work. It was a qualitative study, and as those of you who know, that takes a lot of on-the-ground efforts in terms of talking with people and doing site visits. And so we had a great team of folks that I wanted to acknowledge, as well as the different workforce programs that participated in this particular study. So the purpose of this study was really, as the title says, is really to look inside the black box of successful workforce programs. Really kind of what about their organization, what about their practices, what about their structure, what about their processes, what about the people they serve, really helps them achieve the successful employment outcomes that they're all striving for. And really on top of that is to not only just understand what makes them successful, but where does that element of data and outcomes really come into play, and where are they struggling and where are they doing well. And as all good research starts out, we have a conceptual model. It also, kind of depicts why this study is a little bit different than other studies you may have seen. We really wanted to look at not just the typical factors that a lot of other research has looked at in this field, which is what are the characteristics of the individuals that are served, and maybe what is their particular practice model. We really wanted to look at everything from what's kind of the characteristics of the individual participants, which is in this kind of adapted ecological model, as you'll see. What about their experiences? And then really, in addition to the individuals, what's going on in terms of the particular programs and practices that they're a part of within these community-based workforce development programs. And then within the programs themselves, these programs operate within a larger organization. Sometimes these organizations are solely dedicated towards workforce services, other times they're broader and they do a variety of other support services as well. How are they structured? How are they funded? We really wanted to kind of broaden that macro perspective and look at what's going on in that sphere. And then largely look at, these organizations and programs and individuals, reside and function and work within a larger community context. And they have a lot of engagement with employers. They have a lot of engagement with community partners. They're very active in the policy arena and advocacy arena as well. Kind of what, in terms of those external relationships, what factors are at play there in terms of helping them do a successful job at providing services for individuals. And then lastly, this kind of oval in terms of the role of data and outcomes overlays all four of those spheres. It's really kind of our unique contribution and interest in trying to look at, where does data come into play for each of those? What is measured, what is not measured, what could be measured, and what can we recommend in terms of better understanding and having information about these. So a bit about our sample and our methods. We really relied heavily on kind of a group of experts that are in the local Chicago area that really know these workforce development programs very well. So they were able to nominate numerous programs for us to look at in this particular study. We really defined what is a successful workforce program very loosely. We had our experts really kind of help us shape that as well, but really we're looking for those programs that are geared towards helping individuals achieve successful job placements and retain that employment once they did obtain employment. We really focus this specifically on community-based organizations. There's workforce programs that reside in community colleges or other types of settings, but we really wanted to focus this on the CBOs. We also wanted to focus this on programs that served low-income adults. There's also many programs that serve youth as well, but to try to put a manageable scope on this particular study, we focused on the adult population. We also focused this on the Chicagoland area. This was initially viewed as a pilot study, and to be somewhat manageable, we focused geographically in this area. So in the end, we had 6 different workforce organizations participate in this study. We conducted site visits and interviews with 16 individuals from those different 6 sites. We collected information from field notes. We collected the interviews as well as supplemental information each of the organizations provided, and this is really largely a qualitative analysis. So in terms of findings for this study, they're really organized in terms of our conceptual model, in terms of what we found as successful factors for participants, programs, and practice, then the organization, and then kind of looking at the external factors. So for our initial kind of look at among the participants, programs, and practice, some of the key things that we found that were successful factors among these programs that we visited were really that they're around the recruitment and intake process. They're really unique for each program, but they're very extensive. This is also where kind of they used assessments, and their assessments data was collected and used in a variety of ways. One of the things that we found, however, is that depending on the program, sometimes these skills assessments or needs assessments were repeated throughout, sometimes they weren't. It varied on the program. The other thing that we found among these particular programs, and note that these are the successful programs that we were particularly looking for in this study, is that they really took a holistic approach. They not only looked at trying to address the skills needs, the workforce needs, but they really looked at any psychosocial issues, any basic needs issues. They really tried to take a comprehensive look at addressing all of the needs of the individuals, as well as their families oftentimes, of those involved in the program. And I think that was something that I'm not sure if it's unique because these are the most successful programs we visited, but it was something of note that was constant among those that we visited. And then in terms of, another important element of all of these programs is really their focus on important quality job match for the job placements. Now, this is something they just didn't look at the very end of the program once the individual kind of made their way through their skills training or other parts of the program. It was really something they considered from day one. And they really used a variety of assessments. They used action plans, checklists. They really collected different data depending on the program to try to identify the individual's skill sets and strengths and interests and try to identify the best possible job placement for that individual once they concluded the program. In terms of looking at some of the successful factors amongst the actual provider and organizational level, really there was a strong dedication to the mission, and all of these organizations really focused on empowering the individual, addressing the needs of not only the individual but the family and the broader community, as well as really focusing not just on let's get that first job, but let's get this individual towards a path of self-sufficiency. So they really, everything they did was really around focusing on this particular mission that they had. The other successful factor we identified among these organizations is really their ability to be flexible and adapt to the changing needs of the participants they're serving, the changing needs of the market, the changing needs of employers that they're serving. Obviously, with the recent economic downturn, a lot of these organizations had to be somewhat responsive to the needs of different individuals that were coming to their door looking for services. Some of these individuals were more highly skilled, more highly educated, were a different population than they were used to seeing. So a lot of these organizations really had to be adaptive to be responsive to them. The other issue, as I think several of us have touched on, is there's definitely been budget challenges or funding challenges that have affected most of the workforce programs. So that we really heard a lot about the need to diversify funding. There's a variety of different public dollars, there's a variety of different private dollars to support these workforce programs. And the consistent message we heard from all of the programs that we visited is that you really need to be creative, you really need to diversify, and really need to be adaptive. And so that was definitely a strong point that was made across by all the organizations. The other thing that was mentioned is, or as well as observed, is that there's very strong leadership in these organizations, everything from the board to the directors to the program staff to the frontline staff. There really was kind of a collegial team-like environment where they all supported each other, they all respected each other, and they all really saw the strengths that they brought to the table and really worked together well. So that was very important. And then lastly, in terms of provider and organization factors that we identified, is really that their plans for growth really varied by organization, but they were trying to maintain this balance of, do we grow where we try to broaden our kind of scope of services and what we provide, or do we kind of focus and go tighter and just go deeper and go better in terms of what we're doing and build on our successes right now? And I think part of that tension between their plans for growth really relied on their need to potentially diversify their funding, and do they follow some funding streams that would broaden their scope, or do they kind of stay true to kind of what they're doing now and their strengths and go a little bit deeper? So that was one of the messages that we heard from many of the organizations. In terms of successful factors for external relationships, community, and policy, as you would expect, it's important for all these organizations to build strong relationships with employers. They, basically viewed this as, they had like a dual client mentality oftentimes, the individuals, workforce participants that came in for their services, as well as the employers. They wanted to make sure they met the needs of those employers by providing good job placements for them, which was a win-win for these organizations. They really tried to do this by engaging the employers within the programs themselves. They oftentimes used very creative ways to engage employers. They not only maybe had employers on their board, but they had employers come in and volunteer their time to do mock interviews, to work with the individuals within the program and curriculum itself. And so they're really trying to not only provide services and provide good people to these employers, but engage them in the program, help shape the curriculum into something that employers would want to engage in and hire participants from. There are also large collaborative efforts among workforce programs themselves. They have strongly said that maybe they're not the best best organization to serve a particular person with a set of needs, but they know another organization in the city maybe has strengths to address those particular needs. So they'd often work together to find what the best services organization would be to serve the needs of that individual, as well as work together collaboratively to meet the needs of an employer who maybe had a big request for particular applicants for job openings. And so they'd work together to kind of pool their job applicants together to try to meet those needs as well. So they're actually, they're all doing their own work, but they also work together collaboratively very well. There's also, as you would expect, strong community engagement among these workforce organizations within the communities they serve. This engagement benefits the organizations by it helps them obtain referrals, obviously, but it also allows them to engage with other community organizations to help provide support services. One of the other things that we found that was quite interesting was that the community actually influences not only the types of services that are provided, but also maybe where these services are provided. One of the organizations we looked at took a very specific stance on trying to have economic development within the communities in terms of where would they locate their next organization in terms of opening a new area for services. And so they really wanted to give back and help promote economic development within certain communities as well. And then lastly, to be expected given a lot of the different changes in funding in the current economic climate, all of these organizations really had key staff dedicated towards being very active in advocacy efforts, whether that's through the Chicago Jobs Council or through their own initiatives, and really to engage in the policy discussions that were going on, particularly around funds and use of funds to support their programs. Now we come to kind of the perspective that we had overlaying all of these findings is really the role of data and outcomes. As Carrie mentioned, this research that we did really supports many of the points that she raised, is that programs really collect measures, and they're motivated to collect measures by different requirements they have by funders. However, these often are very limited, and they're often not necessarily the most meaningful for them to really understand what's working or what may not be working within their organizations. Programs oftentimes then supplemented or used additional measures to better understand what's going on in terms of their performance within their organization. And so many times, in kind of using the framework that we have for our kind of conceptual model and our findings, is that they oftentimes collect individual characteristics through assessments or other data collection efforts throughout their time in the program. Some kind of program and organizational and process measures are collected for self-assessment purposes, but then when you start looking at the importance of their external engagement with employers, their external engagement with the community, very little systematic data is collected. I think there's a few programs that we visited that do that well, but on a whole, I think having more information around what relationships are working externally, such as with employers and community organizations, would benefit a lot of these organizations. In terms of data challenges, this also piggybacks on what Carrie was mentioning, is that there's often a limited scope by the current measures and data systems. One of the key things is that oftentimes, particularly for those that are funded by WIA, the Workforce Investment Act funds, or other public dollars, there's public administrative data systems that collect information. However, a lot of these organizations, given the diversity of funding I mentioned, they may not collect information about all the participants being served by a workforce program. So if you really wanted to work with an organization to understand kind of, what's working, what's not working among those people that you're serving. You have to pull from a variety of different data sources, and you may have some serious limitations there. Carrie also mentioned that this also leads to multiple data entry issues, repetitive, redundant data entry issues, and the more time you spend on that, the less time and resources you spend on serving your clients. And then programs really, gave us a consistent message about what they want measures and data to do for them, and they really want this information to help better assess participant progress and outcomes. They really want to be able to demonstrate a better understanding of their program achievements in terms of outcomes and impact they make, largely a lot of this to communicate that when they do fundraising, as well as kind of be responsive to their funders, and to really help them identify where do they need to make improvements. They have organizational goals and strategic plans, and I think data really can help them shape kind of where to focus their efforts going forward. So we came to a conclusion with this research about several recommendations around measurement and data. Excuse me. Really, the key recommendations we have around measurement are really to improve the measures in workforce development by really establishing some common measures given the differences in definitions in terms of what's a successful placement, what do we mean by retention, really trying to identify some commonality across those measures, but also allowing for unique flexibility because a lot of these programs have unique nuances that they would want to have their own particular measures that are specific to their populations or their services. The other recommendation is really around using longitudinal measures to assess individuals' outcomes over time. I think a lot of the current measures are often limited in that there's often a shorter time frame in which they're followed. Kind of having a better perspective of over the long term, how are these individuals progressing or advancing in employment would be useful. And also in terms of improved measures is really trying to look at outcomes and understand the differences by subpopulations for the clients that they're serving. Really trying to understand those that have different barriers to employment, whether that's serving individuals who are ex-offenders, serving individuals who have ESL, serving individuals that may be homeless. So really there's oftentimes just kind of lumped as a large aggregate. And when you serve individuals with significant challenges to employment, it would be really beneficial to start looking at outcomes by those specific subpopulations so you can really know what to expect in a realistic manner for some of these service organizations that work with these individuals. Also, the recommendation was really to expand what is measured to include a lot of what we saw in many of the promising instances we identified in our particular study. Really to use assessment data, more comprehensive assessment data, and use this not just kind of at the beginning when they enter a program, but try to monitor their continual development and advancement of skills throughout the program. Really try to measure these kind of intermediate participant achievements, not just did they ultimately get a credential, did they ultimately complete the program, but maybe they're achieving these intermediate milestones and kind of advancing while they're in the middle of the program that can really give them those small victories towards advancing in the right direction. Really kind of track and use more information about the array of support services. I think oftentimes we saw programs with referrals for support services, but not necessarily followed up to see what actually happened when those support services were provided. The other thing is really in terms of looking at achievement of industry credentials. Oftentimes that first credential is tracked, but if they have, go on and achieve others, sometimes the programs and the individuals aren't given credit for those. So making sure that those are all captured as best as possible. And then also to really look at the tracking information about the engagement of community partners as well as employers and trying to figure out what are those strong relationships and how beneficial are those relationships to achieving outcomes. Lastly, in terms of recommendations around data, we really are recommending that, the field of workforce kind of move towards integrated data systems. And for those of you who know Chapin Hall's work, this should not be surprising. We recommend this quite often. We really want to minimize the redundancy of repetitive data entry, as we've been saying all along. We really want to help collect information across all types of different funding streams, whether that's different public funding streams or private funding streams, to get information on all program participants, and really use this integrated data system to provide programs with meaningful measures so they can use this for self-assessment as well as their reporting requirements to different funders. And really, to allow them to be, these programs, or the integrated data systems to be somewhat flexible to meet the different program needs. Like I said, they're very nuanced. They have different kind of service structures and populations, and to be able to kind of have adaptive features in an integrative data system that would allow them to meet their own particular needs. So in terms of looking at conclusions and policy implications, really kind of using our kind of multi-level kind of conceptual framework, we really found a variety of successful influences. I know I kind of just gave the highlights in this presentation, but the report is going to have much more detail as well as specific examples from the sites that we visited. We really found successful factors not only at the individual participant level, but within the programs and the organizations, as well as the external and community relationships that they had. There are many promising examples of programs using data in creative and innovative ways, but there are many important factors, as I've tried to identify, that are not yet measured or not yet consistently measured that would be useful. And ultimately, programs can benefit from more data on these factors so they can really understand how these different factors really relate to achieving positive employment outcomes. And of course, no study does not have limitations. So I just wanted to point out that this was really a preliminary descriptive study. This was limited to the 6 particular successful programs we visited in the Chicago area, and it's also limited to community-based organizations. Despite these limitations, I think we found some interesting findings that could be useful for a variety of workforce programs throughout the country. I don't think it's necessarily unique to Chicago. But really, I think what all of this work culminates is a need to really pursue additional research and focus on the importance of developing better data and measures for these programs to really better understand how to improve services for the individuals that they're serving. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. And now we'll move to our final speaker, Maria.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This is my first webcast, and I'm really excited that it's this and not some other unfortunate incident as a younger adult. So thanks, everybody, for indulging my bit of humor to break the ice. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the CARE program. We are, if you don't know who we are, we're a workforce development and leadership development organization, essentially, for men and women affected by homelessness and poverty. We've been around for 20 years. We're doing some good stuff, and in case you did not know, the reason why we're called CARA is because CARA is actually a Gaelic word that means friend. We were founded by a Southside Irish guy. He loves the old Irish language, and so that's why he chose to call us the CARA program. So 21 years old, and now I'm about to tell you what we do. Actually, before I dive in, I want to put some of my comments into context based on what I heard earlier today and actually earlier this week from 2 different women in this work. First was Karen, just earlier this morning. I liked what you said when you said we need to be straying away from looking at workforce development as a service, but more as an economic engine. So part of my comments will be about how we attempted to do that, to kind of repurpose our data to illustrate the economic vitality of what we're doing rather than just the service transaction of what we do. And then secondly, I wanted to highlight a comment that was brought up by Susana Vasquez, who is the executive director of LISC Chicago. Earlier this week, she did a presentation on data, and she talked about her struggle with the term data-driven, simply because not all of our choices and whatnot should be data-driven per se, because if they're data-driven in exclusivity, that means we're not employing our judgment. And so data should always be looked at in a certain context, so her term was data-informed. I thought that was pretty inspiring, and I would like you to look at what I'm about to show you with our data in that lens. So just to level set a little bit, let's put our situation into context. I wanted to plow through some key data points that might help you look at it from the macro down into the micro. Ooh, sorry. Right now, a little over 1.7 million Illinoisans live at the poverty level, the federal poverty level. And as everybody knows in this room, the federal poverty level is a little goofy metric that was born in the 1950s based on and around some statistics that are no longer relevant nor geographically relevant. And all we've done is kind of push it up by some inflationary metric year on year, where right now the FPL for a family of 4 is $22,350. So in essence, the way that I interpret that number is if I make $22,351 and I'm a single mother with 3 children, then I'm straight, I'm good. I'm ready. And obviously we all know that's silly talk, and so that's part of what we're hoping to overcome with our work at CARA. So some level setting metrics on us. Since we were founded, we've placed over 3,000 individuals into permanent jobs. We've placed over 1,000 more into transitional jobs, but I don't put that in my money metric. The money metric is really the permanent jobs, because we want to set folks on a pathway to real and lasting success and to economic self-sufficiency, so we focus mostly on our permanent jobs number. In the last year, just to give you additional context, 77% of those individuals celebrated at least 1 year on the job. And so for us, it is not just about job acquisition, it's about job retention that actually helps us to kind of move out of poverty over the long term. And so last year, 77% of individuals that we placed rang the bell at 1 year and said, yep, I celebrated my 1 year on the job. And that is compared to the Department of Labor, about 27 points higher in the same industries that we work with. These outcomes ultimately aggregate into about 24 million in social dividends. I'm going to give you an exhibit in just a few minutes that walks you through how we calculated that number. That's a number that was calculated over a 5-year time horizon, and I'll show you the math behind that. And what we use with that number is to talk about folks who invest in our organization to say, you know, for every dollar that you invest, we're producing about $5.50 back out into society, into our community. And again, I'll show you the math just in a sec. To Beth's earlier point about what's inside the black box, this document is actually in your packet. And if you're on the online community, there's a link to our website that will bring you straight to this original document as well if you want to look at it in a larger format. But this is basically our black box. So I'm not going to go through it in detail. I just want to focus on the chevrons that you see, the brightly colored chevrons at the top. You'll see we do have a very intensive referral and admissions process, where we're actually sourcing folks to come into the program. You can't just ring the doorbell downstairs and say, hey, I'm here to get a job. There's a whole iterative process that is employed in order to screen an individual's readiness for our program, and that speaks to Beth's point in the research. We also have, in the red chevron, a pretty intensive training program. It's not just a job readiness training program. Just as an aside, we talk about some crazy stuff in the classroom. We talk about love. We talk about forgiveness. Who do you need to forgive in order to really focus on your future? We do a conflict management exercise where we pick 2 folks and we say, let's say Beth and I get picked as the co-CEOs of a fake company. The trainer asks us to terminate 2 people in this room right now based on their lack of participation, poor attitude, you know, and just because we don't like them or whatever. And we go ahead and name those people, and forgive me for saying this, but the 2 individuals that get picked get pissed off. And we do that on purpose in order to create massive tension in the room, to diffuse that conflict, to talk about what's going to happen in the workplace when you have somebody that gets up in your grill and is challenged with what you're doing. How do you overcome those conflicts? So I give you just a little bit of those teasers to tell you that our training is not just job readiness, get in front of a computer, look for a qualified job, fill out an application, do a thank you letter, all of that. It is that plus what we call the harder skills that allow you to keep a job over the long term. So that's what's happening in the red. We also have a social enterprise called Clean Slate. Some of you may be aware of that social enterprise. That's a neighborhood beautification business where we're in 19 different communities right now, but more importantly, we're producing about 200 transitional jobs for our hardest to employ. And so we define our hardest to employ as folks who have been recently incarcerated, folks who may have low cognition, low literacy, limited work experience. We want to make sure they get a transitional job through our own business so that ultimately we can put that on their resume and place them into permanent employment, which is what's happening in the next chevron, the quality job placement, that's where we're, as Beth alluded to in her research, where we have strategic partnerships with companies, some of whom we've worked with for over 10 years, to place folks into their open entry-level positions. So a lot of work goes in and around the whole dance of the matchmaking process to make sure we're sourcing the right candidate for the right opening. And then it doesn't end there. We need to add on another chevron, that's stability, retention, and advancement. We work with folks for at least 1 year. For a couple hundred more through a pilot program, we're working with them for 2 years. And in this point, we're really focusing on not just life and work balance so that we can get to that 1-year job retention, but also we're talking to the supervisor to make sure our candidate is still doing well. You know, is there anything, if anything's going superbly well, we want them to call us. If anything's going off, we want them to call us so that we can be that preemptive strike and that preemptive measure to help folks get to 1 year on the job. So that's what's happening in that last bucket right there. And so to the data. So also in your packet, and again for the online viewers, there's a link to our website so you can get to this PDF as well. This document is what we produce at least semi-annually for all our constituents. This is what we call our performance dashboard. At the top line, you're going to see our top line key performance indicators. How many permanent jobs have we produced? How many transitional jobs have we produced? What percentage remain employed for at least 1 year? And for our 2 businesses that we operate not just Clean Slate, but another business called 180 Properties, which is a property preservation business. It's a joint venture with Mercy Housing Lakefront. We publish our productivity metrics for the businesses too. Like, hey, here's the, the tons of trash that we've lifted from the community, and here are the amount of homes that we've serviced through our property preservation business. But perhaps what's more important, so that's kind of your top line indicator. It's really, a lot of funders look at how you're doing and they measure your effectiveness in terms of your permanent jobs and transitional jobs, so on and so forth. But we always want to pass the significant other test. So if I go home and I talk to my guy, is he really going to understand what the hell I'm talking about and why it's relevant? So we do the third band, which is what you see in that third row. It's comparative indicators. Why are the metrics that we just produced for you earlier, why are they relevant? What's important about them? Put them into context so that people can understand kind of the greater impact of what you're producing. So moving from left to right, we show our 1-year job retention vis-a-vis the national norm, so that somebody can easily say, okay, that's a 27-point delta. That's kind of interesting. We publish our wage against the Illinois minimum wage. We publish the annual savings that we work with our students to accumulate over their first year of employment against a national norm for an individual development account study that we found. And finally, for us, we also publish the swing from homelessness to permanency in housing, so that folks know that over that 1-year time horizon where we're working with folks, 86% are in permanent housing. That means their name is on a lease, their kids are back in their care, they're doing homework on the living room floor, they're hanging out as a family. We want folks to know that that's part of why we do that year of intensive support. Certainly it's about the job retention, but it's also about the family reunification that's happening in that process and the stability that's gained. In the bottom quartile, you're going to see some employer-driven outcomes. For example, who are our top employment partners? We like to tout that every once in a while if people get into a competition thing, like why is Northwestern Memorial doing that much? Should we as UCMC do more? Stuff like that. We also, in the middle, take all of our wages, the hours that people have worked, and we annualize it. We look at how long they stayed on that job, and we annualize that data, and we publish how much in earned income they achieved, both through their permanent jobs and through their transitional jobs. And on the right, we publish the industry diversification. A lot of times people think that, oh, if you're working with homeless and at risk of homeless individuals, your jobs must be pretty menial. You're probably doing all cleaning jobs or something like that. And so we want to focus on the diversity of industry so that folks know we don't play. There's a lot of diversity in what we do and a lot of talent that's within the candidate population that we serve. And on the back is just additional demographic information. This goes to Beth's point earlier about the resource, apologize for the slides, the resource the resources that are going in. Remember how she said something about, could we focus on the subpopulations and analyze the outcomes based on subpopulation? This is our attempt to illustrate some of the demographic data in education, in race, in criminal history, so on and so forth for the individuals that we serve. And on the right is just a community spread. This is where our folks are coming from. The darker the color, the more people are coming from there. But in an easy to visualize format, our donors, our employment partners, our constituents can get a glance of where folks are coming from, and at a top level, what is the CARE program doing? And perhaps most importantly is this final exhibit, also in your packet, on social return on investment. This is basically walking through a cohort of individuals that we placed into permanent jobs in 2009. So in case you're wondering, this is real data. A lot of folks do SROI based on postulated data, like we theorize that this is going to happen. This is based on folks that we placed into permanent employment in 2009. And we're first looking at annualized contributions to society. So we looked at their income that they made, and we started to aggregate what are the taxes that they're now paying, the Social Security they're now paying, and the retail spend that we know that they are purchasing as a derivative of their total net income in a year. We also looked at annualized savings to society. So we looked at their demographics coming in. How much did people take in TANF, in temporary assistance for needy families, in food stamps, in unemployment, in leveraging the emergency room as their primary form of health care, in being incarcerated, in employing a homeless shelter, et cetera. We looked at all of those costs, and then if they celebrated at least 1 year on the job, we know that we cost avoided those things. We cost avoided those things, and so we took the net effect of those changes, aggregated that for an additional $6.5 million. We total those two and we get to 7.8. We look at that over a 5-year time horizon and discount it to the present value to get to 24 million. I also wanted, you can see in the little footnote on your exhibit that we add a beefy risk factor to this. So I'm already discounting that 24 million by an additional 20%, just in case I've got any naysayers out there that are like, hey, are you inflating this? Is it too fat? Like, blah, blah, blah. I say that's a totally valid theory, sir. So to combat that, we're going to discount it by 20%. And what we do is we take that 24 million and we divide it by our operating costs. How much does it take to run the joint, basically? And we divide by our operating costs to come up with that 544.9%. So all that work to kind of get to somebody to say, okay, for every dollar in, for every buck that you invest in this organization, we believe we're going to produce about $5.50 of savings and contribution to society. We think that's a pretty good deal. What do you think? And kind of use that as a provoker to begin an active conversation. And for those that are data nerds like we are, you can flip on the back of the exhibit if you want to look at the studies that were used or any of the backstory behind how those numbers were calculated. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So we have about 20 minutes for some conversation now after the panel. I have one question that's come in via the web. I encourage, we'll start with that one to give folks in the room a chance to think about questions that they might have. We have a couple of folks with microphones, so if you could wait for the microphone and then tell us your name and the organization you represent before your question. I'm going to begin with a question from the web, which I think any of the panel members might address, so we'll leave that open. The question is, how do these organizations successfully meet the flexibility to respond to changing needs of clients and changing economic conditions? What informs them? So I think I'll begin with Maria, if you don't mind. What data do you take in to help you think about how the world outside your walls is changing and how you might need to adapt the program to that world?
Mm-hmm. So we use the data that Carrie was alluding to in her presentation to get some sense of the external factors. For example, what industries are emerging and when. A lot of that Cook County forecasting data is very helpful to inform our corporate account managers who target certain companies for our students. But quite frankly, we listen to the beat on the street. Who's calling us to get into the program? And the other panelists are right in that the demographic has changed slightly. People have a preconceived notion about what it means to be homeless or at risk. Last year we had 1 PhD and 2 folks with master's degrees that came through our program that we worked with to get placement. So it's a combination of both listening to the external research and also to folks who call to get into the program to figure out how we need to modulate our services.
Anyone else want to respond to that?
I can chime in a bit also. I don't know if this is on yet. Just to piggyback on what Maria was saying, some of the organizations that we visited in our study really took this to heart. I mean, we were, this was site visits and interviews we conducted over the last 18 plus months. A lot of this time was during the time where they had to be very adaptive to the changing economy. Oftentimes, as Maria was saying, they tried to use whatever kind of projections data, the kind of Department of Labor put out or the state put out. However, they knew there were limitations in that. There's geographic nuances in the industries that they particularly work with, nuances also with their particular populations and communities they work with. So really oftentimes they did rely on more of the informal, as you were saying, word on the street, kind of hearing what the demand was and what the changing demand was. So one organization that was part of our study, which focused largely on manufacturing, they created a whole new training program for welders specifically because there was such a demand from the actual businesses they worked with that they just could not hire enough welders. So that was not even in their portfolio, but they created that to be responsive and help people kind of get into a training that would definitely have a job for them, waiting for them when they finished. So I think it's actually a mixture of some of the formal data, projections data, as well as kind of what they're hearing from the different partners and constituents they work with.
Great. We have a question in the middle of the room there. If you could wait for the microphone, please. Battling microphones.
Thanks. David Martzall with the Center for Economic Progress. This is maybe a question for all the panelists, but whoever wishes to take it. It seems like we're maybe at a data tipping point in a good way. As someone who practices very much as an adjunct to the workforce field and the work we do, we collect a lot of data. But when I look at all of the presentations and Karen talking about reorganizing the entire city-county workforce system, making it more efficient and clearly creating more driven data, Carrie, what you talked about in terms of what CJC provides, and then over Elizabeth, your study, and then Maria, I mean, what you all have done at the CARE program, I see this as much as kind of a organizational branding document, and it's great because I've always loved the metrics, what you all do, but it's also some of what you've done in a way is almost a core set of talking points that could be used for advocacy in terms of why should we invest in workforce programs. And I'm wondering going forward, is there an opportunity in this down economy, but as there's more focus on workforce, to not only centralize data, but to do it in a much more strategic way that connects the work on the ground to the investment strategy from the private sector to the world of policy? Because I can only think at the federal level that Department of Labor imposes a lot of data requirements which may be totally redundant from the federal level and don't help at all at the program level. Right. So just a general question, however you all want to take it.
So I can tell you that we are actually partnering with Chapin Hall right now in terms of, there's a Workforce Innovation Fund grant proposal process that has been opened up through DOL. And we're actually partnering with them to talk about how we reform all of our data collection, not only our process, but what it is we want to get from the data and how we actually translate that into useful information, not only for our delegate agencies, but quite frankly for our clients. So when you talk about in the WIA world, everything is driven by customer choice. And what I've said is it has to be informed customer choice, which means that it's incumbent upon us to gather data and translate that in a way that clients understand, so that as they're choosing what field they want to go into, where they want to actually put the training dollars that we're giving them, that they're looking at fields that we know are reasonably calculated to lead to solid placements that are going to actually improve their lives. One of the things that we're focusing on moving forward is the creation of a self-sufficiency indicator, so that as someone enters into any of our programs, they get an assessment as to how self-sufficient they are, and at the end of it, they do another assessment so that we can tell whether we've actually moved the needle for that client or not. Because if we haven't, then we're not really getting a measurable return on our investment, and we're also not doing a service for those clients. We need to be ensuring that we're able to collect data and analyze it in such a way that we're able to discern true impact for our clients and for our system overall. From a funding perspective, I can't just underscore enough what's been highlighted here today is that every single agency should be doing exactly what CARE is doing. Because at the end of the day, given how tough it is to receive funding, you've got to be able to demonstrate your value to potential funders, whether that be DOL, the state, or us, quite frankly, as we move forward. And so if you can't take all of the information from the many moving pieces that you have and translate that into a story that is compelling, you're not going to survive in these times.
I would also add, I think that's a really good point, David, that there is sort of a tipping point, and I think what Karen talked about really demonstrated we have this opportunity here. There's two big policy drivers that I would point out, which one is decreasing public budgets and challenges there, and the only way we're going to be able to make the case for investments in workforce development and skills training is if we have the evidence that it works and the evidence that it's needed. The second is there is some real directive from the federal level about longitudinal data. So there's, in the education world, there's the state longitudinal data systems funding. Illinois is implementing some of that. There's also a federal workforce data quality initiative, which is really about making sure that the workforce system is part of those longitudinal data systems. And for us, as advocates, and I think this is true for the community-based providers, is that there's still a couple of, not risks, but challenges in that. And one is, will there be capacity in the field to be able to participate? And also, will the field be able to access that information and use it in their work? So it is really an important time right now, and I think this particular conversation and this particular study really is very important to feed into those conversations.
Let me just add one other piece. As we talk about data and talk about sort of the requirements that are placed upon us, from my perspective, those requirements are a floor and not a ceiling. I think we have a responsibility to look and see, for example, in the state's reporting system in IWIDS, and I don't want to bash anyone who might be, watching from the state, since they are my funder, right? But at the end of the day, the data that we're collecting really is not translating into a story that helps us figure out how we need to change our practices. And so we really have to see that as, yes, a mandated requirement, but it is a floor and not a ceiling. I think it's incumbent upon us in our planning process to really figure out what is that ceiling and then just constantly be aspiring to meet that.
Excellent. Let's go to over here.
Hi, Amanda Cage, Quick. I have a question for Chapin Hall. I was one of the folks who nominated organizations to be part of the Ford study, and I'll say that what was interesting was when they called us, the question wasn't what's the most innovative program or the most cost efficient. It was, can you name the best programs? And that's a very subjective question. And so I told you what I thought the best programs were. And I'm wondering, was there a lot of overlap? Did people say the same organizations? That's my first question. And then my second question, and this comes from my position as being both a private funder in a previous job and then also playing that role in the public system, is oftentimes the people who we think of as the best organizations on paper are not the best performers. And I wondered if that was also the case. Objectively, were these the best organizations in terms of their outcomes?
Really good question, Amanda. From the nominations that we received, there was significant overlap. There was definitely a range, but I think there was, I don't know the exact number, but there were definitely outliers in terms of, receiving 4, 5, 6, recommendations per some of the top organizations. So that actually, when we tried to identify those most highly recommended, it was pretty easy given the way the nominations came in. So I think there was a common notion of what those top, 5 or 6 organizations are within the city of Chicago. So there's quite a bit of consensus. What we also ended up doing, we tried to look at the specific outcomes, and once we got those nominations in to see, quantifiably, can we say that these are some of the top performers? And I would say some of those came out true. Other ones, maybe not as much, because several of the organizations also served individuals with barriers to employment, such as homeless populations or ex-offenders. And so because the numbers we had available to look at were aggregate numbers, it was really hard to kind of break out those subpopulations to see exactly how successful they were. But we did take that into consideration as well. But it was pretty well represented in terms of what the top organizations were in the city, which were the ones that we ended up going out to.
It is a great question. I think we would hope that in a few years we wouldn't have to go seek nominations. We would have a data system that would really tell us every year who are the top performers, given, again, as Beth noted, the folks they're trying to serve. And unless you can understand who they're serving, it is hard to interpret those outcomes, because some people are taking a very tough population and doing very well with it, but their outcomes on aggregate don't look the same as those who might be taking another population. So, good question. Let's, Karen, did you want to add to that?
I just wanted to say, towards that end, one of the things that we're focusing on moving forward is differentiation for the agencies in terms of performance. If you're taking on a harder to serve population, you're going to have to spend more money if they're at a lower end of the spectrum and require additional and more intensive training. And so that needs to be taken into consideration in terms of the performance outcomes, and it's something that we're very much focused on.
And it's this is an exciting area for Chapin Hall, because other fields, I think, are ahead of the workforce field in doing that. The medical field does it. The foster care system is getting better at thinking that way and differentiating contracts based on what people are trying to do, and it's exciting to think that workforce could do just as well or even better. Let's take one more question from the middle of the room here, and then we'll go on to the web for a final question.
Hi, Jonah Kushner from the Social Impact Research Center at Heartland Alliance. My question, I think, is primarily for Dr. Wiegensberg about the Ford study. I'm really looking forward to reading that. I think that will help us make sense of some of the interviews that we've done with workforce providers. My question is mostly about what you learned about recruitment and intake. It seems like workforce development programs walk kind of a fine line. On the one hand, they want to choose people who are sufficiently disadvantaged that the program is a good fit for them and they're good targets, but they also want to choose people who are sufficiently advantaged that they can make it in a job and are able to advance. I know that we're working on an evaluation of a program that's out of state that's having some challenges with making those calls about which people to take in. So I wondered if you learned anything about how programs successfully target people in the programs that you studied, and maybe what data they use to do that.
Sure. I'm happy to tell you what I've learned from our particular study, but I don't know if Maria has thoughts, from CAR specifically. But that was something we looked at very closely. I mean, and for those familiar with this field, you hear the term creaming often in terms of those, taking the top performers into the program, knowing that they're going to help you achieve the most successful outcomes. Really, the consistent message we got from all of the programs we visited is that they do take this very seriously. They do get a lot of people seeking their services. They might not always be able to serve everyone just for different capacity restrictions, but also the fact that their programs may have a very specific model. They may have a very rigorous set of requirements, whether those requirements are kind of basic skill level requirements or literacy requirements, where you need to kind of take a TABE test to see if they're at a sufficient level to succeed in the curriculum in which that program is providing. Some programs may have other kind of requirements, such as drug testing requirements. Other programs do not, depending on their particular model. And we saw that range among the programs we specifically visited for our study as well. But I think everybody really is trying to find a good fit. They don't want to take someone in who is not necessarily ready to succeed, but I didn't necessarily look at that as the same as creaming. I think most, if not all of the programs we looked at really wanted to serve those that were disadvantaged or had serious challenges or barriers to employment or really struggled. And I think that's where the kind of holistic or comprehensive approach really came in trying to address all of the barriers, whether those are family challenges, housing challenges, or other kind of literacy challenges, and really kind of comprehensively work with the individuals that they knew could succeed and could do well if given the right set of supports. But it's a good question. I don't know if Cara has.
I appreciate, Beth, what you said about creaming, because that is a question that we get a lot. That's why we publish the demographics on the back of the report, to be clear on the barriers that folks are facing. Like half our population has criminal background, criminal history. 80-some% are living in transitional shelters at the time they get accepted into the program. What we are screening for is motivation. And so how do we do that? Again, you can't ring the doorbell, as I illustrated. You have to be referred by somebody, another referral agency, a domestic violence coach, your case manager at DHS, your pastor. Somebody needs to refer you into the program simply to have the conversation with you about the fact that this is a full-time gig. It's 32 hours a week. It's 8:30 to 5. Are you ready for it? And to have that conversation with the individual. Then we talk to them ourselves. We go through the rigor of the program. We ask them if they're still in. Invariably, everybody says yes. We ask them another question. We say, if you're really still in, do me a favor, call me Wednesday at 10. Can you do that? Call me Wednesday at 10. And if they don't call Wednesday at 10, we don't accept them for that month. We also are screening for sobriety. So if they're in recovery, they do need to take a drug test. And if they drop dirty, they will not be accepted into the program. And finally, we're looking for integrity. That's our final measure of motivation. And we measure that based on disclosure. So we don't care and we don't judge based on anything that may have happened in the past, but we do need to know about it. You do need to talk about it. And if you don't disclose in your interview, we run a background check on every individual that we accept. If there's a significant disparity between the paper and what you said, you won't get accepted into the program. So it's those types of iterative milestones that we employ in order to assess motivation and integrity before an individual gets accepted. But it's not intended to box out somebody who's got serious barriers but has the motivation to overcome them. It's simply intended to box out those that might not be ready for the rigor of the program as it exists right now.
So I don't mean to be an acronym slave, but I will say in our office, my staff can tell you that the thing that I focus on most when we're talking about intake, I call it AID: aptitude, interest, and demand. We have got to be assessing for far more than whether you have the technical skills to move forward in a program. If you don't have the motivation and the interest in doing the work, because it is hard work. Getting a job, looking for a job, is a full-time job. I mean, that is what the CARE program is essentially lifting up for folks. And so as we move forward in our model, we're looking at those three things. So where does your aptitude and your interest mesh with the demand that actually exists, and then how can we get you trained so that you're able to meet the demand of the employers? Because otherwise, you're going to be jobless. And that is, we've got to be constantly kind of redefining our focus. So motivation is absolutely a critical factor. And if folks aren't screening for it, there's going to be a problem. We are extremely concerned with creaming because we want to make sure that we're able to meet the needs of the vast array of unemployed and underemployed in the system.
Great. I have one, what I think will be a quick question for Beth that came in via email, which is whether the forthcoming report will list the different funding sources and reporting requirements for the organizations that are involved. And this gets, again, I think, to an important point we all recognize this morning, which is there are a lot of data requirements in the system, and the question is how to eliminate redundancy and make them more useful to the agencies.
Good question. I think we have quite a bit of information in our report in terms of details about specific measures that are used in the different funding requirements. We also, I don't think we do like a comprehensive kind of listing of all of them, but there are some commonalities that you'll see if you're WEA funded, for example, or receive other public funding. And so we do kind of note those throughout the report as needed, and also talk about the different feedback we heard from the different participants in the study about kind of the strengths and limitations to those particular measures. So there is some detail there, but it's not necessarily a comprehensive catalog of the required measures per se.
Great, and again, that report will be appearing, we hope, soon, so keep your eyes open for that. We're coming to the close of our session. I first want to thank the panel for taking the time this morning to address a very important topic, so let's give them a round of applause. I also want to thank the audience for taking an hour and a half of their day to, I hope, engage, learn, get some new perspectives that they can carry forward. So thank you for coming. I want to thank Beth and her team for generating this research, and Beth for crafting the concept of the panel, and finally the Chapin Hall communications staff, Ann and Matt and Chris and Ada, for putting it all together and making it available.